Have you been struggling with figuring out what crosshair you should use in Marvel Rivals? There's been a lot of talk going around about there being these specific crosshairs that somehow give you amazing aiming abilities on a lot of heroes, like this one or this one or this one, but these crosshairs have some fatal flaws. They really only work in perfect scenarios over specific ranges. They take way too long to set up and ultimately will end up being crutches that hurts you not too far down the line. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some great options for crosshairs out there, but there's a reason you rarely see anyone in the What Above All or your favorite streamers using any of these gimmicky crosshairs, and it's for a simple reason. They don't work, and if anything, they make you aim worse rather than make you aim better. And we could go on and on and on about why they don't work, but I think we'll do something more productive today. So today I figured I'd teach you guys how to find the perfect crosshair for your aiming style, as well as offering some suggestions if you need some place to start. Anyways, but before we move on, I'm gonna tell you guys about a huge giveaway I am doing with Logitech G. They sent me their new keyboard, the Pro X TKL Rapid, that was designed in partnership with the world's top esports pros. There's 3 things about this keyboard that set it apart from any other keyboard that you've used. First, there are magnetic analog switches made with adjustable actuation points in 0.1 millimeter increments and a rapid trigger functionality for super precise movement. Look at this beautiful thing here. Let's take a look at it. Secondly, as mentioned earlier, they made this keyboard with the help of literally hundreds of esports pros. They have a whole program to make collaborations with pros to make the best possible products. And the keyboard allows anyone to easily adjust the actuation points without using a third-party software, which most tournaments wouldn't allow, so that you can set it up and save it to the keyboard. And finally, through the G Hub integration, you can access multiple ways to customize the keyboard to your liking. Thanks to the customizable actuation points, you can even add a way where if you, for example, hold down W just a little bit, you'll walk slowly, but if you hold it all the way down, you would start sprinting. And I remember a while back, we were talking about all the different variants for this type. You have the rapid triggers, you have all the actuation points, keyboards out there. And I was always so sad that Logitech G didn't have this because it gives you a massive competitive advantage. With how fast these actuation points are set, it's super fast. And thanks to the rapid trigger, you can really just turn around on a dime. It's practically cheating. If you still play Apex, having a consistent keyboard with custom actuation points makes it easier to perform like a super glide. And if you play most hero shooters, you will strafe much faster and much more consistently thanks to rapid trigger and actuation point. So I'm super glad that Logitech G also made this. And if you guys want this keyboard that is way ahead of its time, make sure to comment on the video below, as well as the giveaway tweet I've posted in the comments, and you will automatically be entered. Thank you again, Logitech G, for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to it. So obviously, before we dive into the actual crosshairs, along with some of my favorite examples, I just have something to say about the default crosshair. By default, you have this dot in the middle crosshair with a circle that adjusts depending on your recoil and your bloom. So if I'm playing Punisher, then the circle grows as I keep shooting the assault rifle, and it changes to a much larger circle if I swap to the shotgun, and it gradually decreases in size as I keep firing the ultimate. Personally, I am not a fan of this crosshair, since it makes it feel like the outer edges sort of signals that there's supposed to be some additional accuracy from the heroes that just isn't there, and it's just not as easy to track compared to my own. It's also very distracting to have the bloom jumping around, but all that matters is that you keep your aim on the target. So as for actual good crosshairs, and I know I might shatter your bubble when I say this, but most crosshairs do not help. And as I mentioned previously, if anything, they give you bad habits, they do nothing at all, or make you aim way worse. High time to kill or tracking based games like Overwatch, Quake, or obviously Marvel Rivals have a few set crosshairs that stand out above the rest, and they have been staples for decades for a good reason. There are 4 crosshair archetypes that I would recommend starting with. First, there is the simple dot. Is the crosshair that I use, and it feels great to use when tracking targets across all ranges. Depending on what hero I play, I might end up making the dot larger if I'm playing something like a Punisher that needs to track across all ranges and hit banger shotgun shots, or maybe I'll be playing a Star-Lord. Or I choose to go for a smaller crosshair if I'm playing high-precision heroes like Hela or even Black Widow. Well, it works for me and a lot of other aimers out there, especially if you look across the pond and take a look at Valorant or Counter-Strike players, depending on the size. It is not a crosshair I would recommend unless you're confident that you have very good raw aim, as you are lacking the typical guides of a normal crosshair, which makes initially flicking onto your targets a bit more challenging. You're still free to give this one a try, and I really recommend that you try all of these crosshairs out, but you'll probably see more success with the following 3 crosshairs instead. For example, there's a typical crosshair that most tactical shooter players like Counter-Strike players might recognize. Just a cross shape with a negative space in the middle. This crosshair is perfect to help you with securing flicks over most ranges, as you easily can use the vertical lines to ensure that your crosshair is on target horizontally, so to the left and right, and the horizontal lines to make sure that your crosshair is on target vertically, so up and down. Let's say if you want to line up a headshot. In the most common versions of the crosshair, the gap in the middle is pretty small, just enough to fit a head or an enemy inside of it. In this case, you would use the negative space as a guide. When the enemy is inside of the hole, then it's time to shoot. The longer the reticle lines are, the more it helps you with lining up your flicks, but at the cost of taking up a lot of vital space in the middle of your screen where your enemies should be. The third crosshair is a bit of a mix of both. It's a cross-shaped crosshair with a dot in the middle. This sort of serves the same purpose as the cross-shaped crosshair, since you can flick onto targets with a little bit of help, but you can still track fairly easily by making sure that the dot is on the target, rather than using the negative space in between the lines to secure that you have a target before shooting. When using a crosshair with a dot, then you want to make sure that there's some gap around that dot to ensure you still have some negative space, as it still does help your aim, and then you can make sure that the reticles are long enough to help you flick onto the target without sacrificing any visual clarity. Now, personally, I do not like these crosshairs because while they are pretty useful, they're also very visually cluttered and they get in the way of what I'm actually trying to aim at. But I really recommend trying all of the crosshairs out before deciding which one to go for. There's also one more crosshair that's a bit of a mix of the dot crosshair and the typical cross-shaped crosshair. This one is a smaller crosshair, but it is a full cross that completely closes in the middle. This serves the purpose of being a dot-ish shape that you can track with without taking too much visual space, while still helping you out with lining up your flicks, or at the very least your micro flicks. And if none of the other crosshair archetypes really fit you, then this might be the one for you. Obviously, there's going to be more types of crosshairs out there, but as you look at the high-ranked players in all types of shooter games, all types of first-person shooters, all types of third-person shooters, these are the few archetypes that you see coming up over and over again. And now that you know about the types, congratulations on your first step on having great aim. You're probably going to want to customize them to fit your needs, or to at least make something optimal for your own playstyle. So let's go over how the crosshair settings work, so you can tailor the archetype that you chose so it fits you perfectly. Moving on to the actual fine-tuning settings. Width adjusts the overall thickness of the crosshair. If you hit the plus sign, depending on which shape you're using, then you can adjust the width of each piece of the crosshair individually. The ability to fine-tune each part, depending on the pieces, applies to all of the different settings in the menu, so I'm not going to mention it again. Just wanted to bring it out there. Tuning the width of your crosshair is always a good idea, though most people have a tendency of letting it get too thick or maybe even too thin, which might cause visibility issues down the line. You want it to be as thin as possible, while still having it be easily readable in the middle of a fight. Just remember that you're not only going to have your crosshair, but you're going to have an outline as well, so don't go too crazy here. The reticle opacity adjusts the opacity of the crosshair. Generally speaking, I would argue that tinkering with the opacity isn't worth it for any of the typical styles of crosshairs. Readability is always going to be king, and messing with the opacity will just blur things together if you're flicking really fast, and if you're not looking exactly at the crosshair at all times, you are going to lose it and you're going to mess up your flick. If your crosshair isn't too thick or too large in general, then leaving the opacity on full is just fine. The outline width lets you change the width of the outline. It's pretty self-explanatory. And this one is important to pay attention to. If you have a bright base color on your crosshair, but you feel that the crosshair is too hard to read against bright surfaces, then you usually just want to raise the outline width, as this makes the contrast a lot clearer. I'd say that you rarely want the outline width to exceed the actual crosshair width, but obviously depending on your vision, I'd probably say that the outline never should be as thick as the crosshair itself. Always half of the width or less. The outline opacity lets you change the opacity of the outline instead of the opacity of the whole crosshair as a whole. And as for outline opacity, I probably wouldn't use it myself, but I can see why some people might find it comfortable if they want an outline to help the crosshair from standing out against bright colors, but they still don't want the crosshair to have the same visual weight as a filled-in outline, because that is always something you have to be careful with. Visual clarity is always important, but you don't want to have too much weight on the crosshair itself, where it starts taking too much focus to process it. Generally speaking, if you do want less weight from the outline, then you can just make it thinner. If you can't make it as thin as you want, then I guess lowering the outline opacity is a good final resort rather than turning it off completely. The blur lets you make your crosshair blurrier. On its own, I have a hard time seeing what purpose this feature even serves. I think it might be useful if you're trying to cook some odd looking or meme crosshair where making one part of it blurrier has a specific effect you might be going for. But as far as readability goes, blurring your crosshair does the complete opposite of being useful. Sort of like putting bear goggles on your crosshair instead of actually helping you. And finally, closing out the shapes. If you hit the plus and if you're using a cross crosshair, then you can change the gap of it here. If you hit the plus again, there are a few different options that let you fine-tune a gap between the lines of the crosshair, the radius of the circle in the middle if you have one, the length of the crosshair lines, and the angle of the crosshair lines. If you're choosing to use a crosshair, then closing the gap is paramount, since you'll be aiming for the negative space, and the more negative space, the more difficult it will be for you in knowing where the middle of your screen actually is. If you want to use the crosshair with a dot, then it makes sense to open the spread up a little bit so you can use the lines as a guide for your flicks, but still be able to aim and track with the dot and have some negative space around it so you can see what you're shooting at. As for the length of the crosshair lines, I kind of mentioned this previously, but it will come down to how much you need them. But generally speaking, these shouldn't be too long, as while longer lines help you with really wide flicks, it will get in the way more often than not, and you're better off with pretty small lines more than anything. And finally, I wouldn't bother with crosshair angle at all. It provides no real value and just kind of looks goofy when it comes to elevating your raw aim, because generally speaking, you're going to be moving your aim either up, down, left, or right, or a combination of all of those. And by having a tilted aim, it just makes everything really weird. But I guess if you're kind of leaning your neck or screen all the time, maybe it makes sense. What do I know? When it comes to the color of the crosshair, this part is actually really important, maybe even more important than some of the specific shape options I mentioned previously. And it will go into a little bit of color theory, your own eyes and possible color blindness or weaknesses, and so much more. But in short, you're going to want to have a contrasting color to the enemy outline color. If you don't have any specific settings, then your enemy outlines will be red. The reason enemy outlines are red is not just because it's the thing everyone's been doing and that it's tradition, but it's also the first color that the eye picks up on. It makes the most sense to leave this outline color as it is, but if you are struggling on seeing your enemies, then yellow is supposedly the color that your eyes see the best, not as soon as red, so setting the enemy outlines to that will help you out as well. If you have a yellow outline, then you will usually benefit from a blue or maybe a purple crosshair instead. But obviously, if you don't touch the enemy outline colors, then you will see the most value with a green crosshair. As I mentioned previously, making sure you have an outline is almost a must, and I would avoid using all white or all black crosshairs, especially without an outline, as these are prone to blending in to bright or dark backgrounds, which get in the way of visual clarity. Overall, using my examples as a base, you will want to find a crosshair that works the best for you personally. If you are losing your crosshair a lot during fights, then you need to make sure to up the visibility until it isn't a problem. If you're unable to see things because your crosshair is blocking them, then you will need to make it smaller. And remember, when using a crosshair to aim, you should rarely, if ever, actually use the crosshair itself to line up the shots. The crosshair should be completely natural to you. It should almost be intuitive for you to know where the crosshair is and where the enemy is and how you need to move your aim to actually connect the shot. You should be focusing on what you need to shoot at rather than at the crosshair, and trust your hands and brain to make this calculation to close the gap. And that's why we need a crosshair that assists in this process rather than one that bogs it down and complicates it and forces you to focus on things that don't matter. A few other things when creating your crosshair that I think would help is, of course, that when you are setting up your crosshair, it'll be easy to lose track of what you had before, the settings or whatever. There's a lot of numbers being thrown around. You can always save the crosshair you like or you want to try out or feel comfortable with, but you should also take a look at this star icon in your settings. If there's a star icon, this means that your setting has been changed from the default values. And if you have a slider setting, there's always going to be an arrow on the sliders which shows whichever the default value is. Additionally, I would love for there to be an option to change your crosshair if you're playing heroes that have multiple weapons, such as Punisher, so I could make the crosshair slightly larger or the outline thicker once I swap to the shotgun, but all you have is the reticle animation changing the bloom size when swapping. For example, if you're using a default crosshair, which in my opinion is just too distracting to actually be of any use. And well, I had a lot of things to say. Hopefully this puts you guys on the right path on getting a great crosshair and, actually getting to start popping off with some crazy aim clips and moments with some crisp, clean locks. If this ended up helping you, feel free to share your own crosshair in the comments. I'm curious to see what you guys cooked up. Anyways, thank you for watching. Check out the video on the screen if you want to get even better at Marvel Rivals, and I'll see you all next time. Peace out.